Have you ever looked around your own home and wondered whether the people you love still see your memories the way you do? At our age, every doctor's appointment reminds us that time moves a little faster than we'd like. Sometimes our knees ache before we even get out of bed. Sometimes we walk into a room and forget why we went there. And every now and then, we blame our fading memory when something isn't where we thought we left it. But what if one day, you discovered that what was missing hadn't been forgotten at all? What if the last piece of the person you loved most hadn't disappeared because of old age, but because someone else had already decided what it was worth? That was the question I never imagined I'd have to answer. I'm 70 years old, and for 48 wonderful years, I was married to the only woman who could make even the most ordinary day feel like something worth remembering. 3 years ago, I lost her after a long battle with illness. People often say time heals grief. I don't believe that. I think grief simply becomes quieter. You learn to live beside it. You smile when people expect you to smile. You keep yourself busy. Somehow the world keeps moving forward even when part of yours stopped. There was only one thing that never changed. Every Sunday morning, before breakfast, I'd walk over to the little bookshelf in my living room and pick up a small black velvet box. Inside was my wife's wedding ring. To anyone else, it was just an old gold band. To me it was 48 years of promises, sacrifices, laughter, tears, and every dream we'd built together. It wasn't jewelry. It was our marriage. Every Sunday I'd open that box for just a few quiet seconds. Not to make sure the ring was still there, but to remember her smile, to hear her laugh in the silence of the house, to remind myself that love doesn't disappear simply because the person you love is gone. I thought I was simply keeping her memory alive. I never imagined someone else had been quietly paying attention to that little Sunday ritual. Looking back, there was one conversation I should be taken far more seriously. A few weeks earlier, my daughter had looked around the house and smiled. "You know, Dad, maybe it's time to let go of some of these old things." She sounded caring. She smiled when she said it. So I smiled back. I never asked myself why those conversations became more frequent every time she visited. If I had, maybe I would have seen what was coming before it was too late. Yesterday morning, I followed the same routine I'd followed for years. I walked to the bookshelf, picked up the little velvet box, smiled without even realizing it, and slowly lifted the lid. It was empty. For several long seconds, I couldn't breathe. The first person I blamed was myself. Had I moved it? Had I forgotten where I'd put it? I searched every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf, every room. Minutes passed. Nothing. That's when denial gave way to something much worse. Someone hadn't simply found the ring. Someone had taken it. And what terrified me wasn't that the ring was gone. It was the horrible feeling that the person who took it wasn't a stranger. It was someone I loved. By the end of that same day, I'd find myself standing inside a small neighborhood jewelry store, face to face with a man I'd never met before. He looked at me, then he looked at the old photograph I was carrying, then back into my eyes. What he said next didn't just explain where my wife's ring had gone. It made me question everything I thought I knew about my own daughter. I wish I could tell you that what happened that morning came completely out of nowhere. It would certainly make this story easier to understand. But life rarely falls apart all at once. It happens one small crack at a time, so quietly that by the time you notice, the damage has already been done. After my wife passed away, my daughter became the person who checked on me the most. At first, I was genuinely grateful. She'd stop by with groceries, insist on driving me to doctor's appointments, and remind me to take my medication. Every time she hugged me goodbye, I'd think about how proud her mother would have been to see the caring woman she'd become. That's why I never questioned her. And that's exactly why I missed what was changing right in front of me. Whenever she visited, she'd slowly wander through the house, stopping in front of things she'd barely noticed before. My wife's antique clock, the old china cabinet, a little wooden music box we'd bought on our honeymoon. She'd pick one up, smile, and casually ask, "Dad, have you ever thought about selling some of these?" I'd laugh. "They're not taking up space. They're filling the empty spaces." She'd smile back, change the subject, and we'd move on. At least that's what I thought. Looking back, those conversations weren't really about cleaning out the house. They were about finding out what I was willing to let go of. There was another change I didn't recognize until it was far too late. She stopped asking about the memories. She used to love hearing the stories behind every keepsake, how her mother and I met, why the music box mattered, or how we'd survived those difficult early years together. Then, almost without me noticing, her questions changed. Instead of asking, "What does this mean to you?" she started asking, "What do you think it's worth?" It seemed like such a small difference. I convinced myself it didn't matter. Parents become experts at explaining away the things they don't want to believe about their own children. Even now, I wonder if I was protecting her or protecting myself. Then, about 3 weeks before the ring disappeared, Something happened that Sholvi opened my eyes. It was Sunday morning. She happened to be visiting while I finished my little ritual. I gently placed my wife's wedding ring back into its velvet box and set it on the bookshelf. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched. Then, almost casually, she asked, "Dad, have you ever wondered how much a ring like that might be worth today?" The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down at the ring, smiled, and quietly answered, "More than anyone could ever afford." She laughed, thinking I was making a joke. But I wasn't, because the value of that ring had nothing to do with gold. It was the last promise I'd ever made to the woman I loved. For a brief moment, something changed in her expression. It disappeared so quickly that I convinced myself I'd imagined it. She simply smiled, kissed my cheek, told me she'd see me next week, and walked out the front door. I watched her drive away, never realizing I'd just witnessed the beginning of everything that was about to happen. The conversation wasn't over. It had only just begun. I didn't call the police. Looking back, maybe I should have. But when you've spent 70 years believing your home is the safest place in the world, your first instinct isn't to assume someone stole from you. It's to assume you made a mistake. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe I'd placed the ring somewhere else. Maybe I'd been distracted. Maybe age had finally started playing tricks on me. So I searched. I emptied every drawer in the bedroom. I checked every cabinet in the kitchen. I looked between couch cushions, inside old coat pockets, behind books on the shelves, and even through boxes I hadn't opened since my wife passed away. Hours slipped by. With every place I crossed off the list, the house felt quieter, heavier, until I found something that changed everything. The velvet box wasn't the only thing that was missing. Hidden inside that same bookshelf had always been a small envelope containing the original receipt for the ring and an old appraisal from years ago. I rarely looked at it, but I knew exactly where it belonged. The envelope was gone. That was the moment hope disappeared. Whoever had taken the ring hadn't stumbled across it by chance. They knew exactly what they were looking for. I lowered myself into my wife's favorite chair and just sat there. For the first time that morning, I stopped searching and started thinking. Someone had walked through my home, opened that little velvet box, taken the one thing that meant more to me than anything else I owned, and somehow, they'd known exactly where to find it. There was only one person besides me who knew where I kept it. Even allowing myself to think those words filled me with shame. No parent wants to imagine the worst about their own child. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over my daughter's name for nearly a minute before I finally pressed call. She answered on the third ring. At first, her voice sounded cheerful, but the moment I asked, "Have you been by the house recently?" everything changed. It wasn't what she said. It was the silence before she answered. Just a second, maybe two. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. When you've known someone since the day they were born, you learn to hear what isn't being said. Finally she replied, "I stopped by a few days ago. You weren't home, so I just left some groceries in the kitchen." Then she quickly asked, "Why?" I closed my eyes for a moment. Part of me wanted to pretend nothing was wrong. The other part needed the truth. So I told her, "The ring is gone." Silence. Longer this time. Then she quietly asked, "Dad, are you sure you didn't just misplace it?" Those words hurt more than I expected. Not because they were unfair, because I'd already spent the entire morning asking myself the very same question. I told her about every drawer I'd searched, every room, every cabinet. Then I mentioned the missing envelope. She didn't sound shocked. She just went quiet. A few seconds later, she sighed and said, "Maybe it's just a ring." Just a ring. To anyone else, those words might have sounded harmless. To me they erased 48 years of memories, with a single sentence. Before I could ask another question, she told me she was busy, promised she'd call later, and ended the conversation. I stared at the phone long after the call had ended. I still couldn't prove anything. I still didn't want to believe anything. But for the first time since losing my wife, I felt completely alone. Then another thought crossed my mind. If someone had taken the ring, they hadn't taken it just to hide it. They'd taken it for a reason. And suddenly, I knew where I had to start looking. By the next morning, I had only one plan. If someone had taken my wife's ring to sell it sooner or later, it would have to pass through the hands of a jeweler. I slipped the old photograph of my wife into my jacket pocket, grabbed my car keys, and started driving from one jewelry store to another. Every store looked almost identical. Bright lights, glass cases filled with sparkling diamonds, young couples smiling as they searched for engagement rings. Meanwhile, I was searching for the last piece of my own marriage. The first jeweler glanced at the photograph and shook his head before I had even finished explaining. "I'm sorry, sir, I've never seen it." The second store gave me the same answer. By the third, I had already begun to lose hope. By early afternoon, my legs ached, my back was stiff, And one thought kept repeating itself. Maybe I was too late. Maybe the ring had already been melted down. Maybe it had been sold to someone hundreds of miles away. Maybe I'd never see it again. For a moment, I almost turned the car around. I almost went home, but something inside me refused to give up. Not yet. That's when I noticed a small family-owned jewelry shop tucked between an old bookstore and a bakery. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't modern. In fact, I might have driven right past it if something hadn't made me slow down. Even now, I can't explain why I walked inside. The little bell above the door chimed softly. Behind the counter stood a man who looked to be about my age. Gray hair, reading glasses resting near the end of his nose. He looked less like a salesman and more like someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to other people's stories. He smiled warmly. "What can I do for you today, sir?" I reached into my jacket, unfolded the old photograph of my wife wearing her wedding ring, and quietly explained that it had disappeared from my home. "I was just hoping," I said, "that maybe you've seen it." He took the photograph. At first nothing changed. Then his eyes stopped. He leaned closer. His smile slowly faded. Without saying a word, he opened a drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a small magnifying glass. He studied the photograph for several long seconds. The shop became so quiet. I could hear the ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall behind him. Finally he lowered the photograph, looked at me, looked back at the picture, then into my eyes again. His expression had completely changed. "May I ask you something?" I nodded. "Was there," he said carefully, "an inscription inside the band?" Every hair on my arm stood up. I had never mentioned an inscription. I hadn't said a single word about the inside of the ring. The engraving was something only my wife and I had ever known. My heart began pounding. I stepped closer to the counter. "How?" I whispered. "Could you possibly know that?" The jeweler didn't answer. Instead, he slowly looked toward the front window, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he turned back to me. "I think," he said quietly, "you'd better sit down." In that moment, I stopped wondering who had taken the ring. I wanted to know why this complete stranger had recognized it before I'd even finished telling him my story. I lowered myself into the chair across from the counter, but I couldn't take my eyes off the man standing before me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. There was only one inscription inside that ring. Almost no one even knew it existed. My wife and I had it engraved on our 25th wedding anniversary. It wasn't visible unless someone removed the ring and looked inside. She used to smile and call it our little secret, a promise meant only for the two of us. So how could this complete stranger possibly know about it? The jeweler folded his hands on the counter. For a long moment he simply looked at me. Then he spoke. "There's a reason I recognize that ring." He paused. "Because," another pause. "I saw it yesterday." The words seemed to drain the air from the room. The ticking clock, the quiet music, the traffic outside, everything disappeared. There were only 4 words left in my mind. "I saw it yesterday." I leaned forward before I even realized I was moving. "Who brought it in?" Instead of answering, he studied me for another moment. Then he quietly asked, "Before I tell you, I need to know something. Did that ring belong only to your wife, or to both of you?" "It belonged to both of us," I answered without hesitation. "I placed it on her finger the day we were married. When she passed away, she wanted me to keep wearing it." He slowly nodded, as though my answer confirmed something he'd been hoping wasn't true. Without another word, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a worn leather notebook. He flipped through several pages before stopping. "I keep notes whenever something doesn't feel right." He rested his finger on one page. "Yesterday afternoon, a woman came in asking if I'd buy an old wedding ring." My stomach tightened. She said it had been sitting in a drawer for years and she wanted to get rid of it. He looked back at me, but the moment I picked it up, I looked inside. Most people never do. Jewelers always do. He took a slow breath. The engraving wasn't elaborate. It was just one sentence. He met my eyes. Forever wasn't long enough. I closed my eyes. My wife had chosen those words herself. On our 25th anniversary she'd smiled at me and whispered, "One lifetime could never be enough." I remembered laughing as we stood together watching the jeweler carefully engrave those words inside the band. For years I'd almost forgotten that afternoon. Now every second of it came rushing back. The jeweler waited quietly before speaking again. "When I read those words, I knew I wasn't holding an ordinary ring. I was holding someone's life." A lump formed in my throat. If he'd read the inscription, then he'd held the ring in his own hands. That thought hurt almost as much as losing it. I finally managed to ask, "So, did you buy it?" He immediately shook his head. "No." I refused. The woman seemed desperate for money, but something about her story never made sense. She knew exactly how much gold was worth, but she couldn't tell me when the ring was made, why it was engraved, or why anyone would choose those words. He slowly closed the notebook. That's when I realized the ring probably didn't belong to the person trying to sell it. A cold wave passed through me. For the first time, There was no room left for denial. The ring hadn't been lost. Someone had taken it. Someone had tried to turn 48 years of love into a handful of cash. The jeweler looked at me for a long moment. Then he quietly said, "I know who brought the ring into my shop." He paused. "But before I tell you who it was, there's something you need to understand first." I wasn't ready to hear the name. Part of me still hoped the jeweler had mistaken someone else for the person who brought in the ring. Maybe it had changed hands. Maybe there was some explanation that would make everything make sense. Instead, he quietly walked toward the front door, turned the small sign from open to closed, and locked it. When he returned, he looked at me with the kind of expression you only wear when you know the truth is about to hurt someone. "I didn't buy the ring," he said. But before the woman left, I asked for her driver's license. It's something I occasionally do when a situation doesn't feel right. He reached beneath the counter one last time, and slid a small business card across to me. On the back was a name. I stared at it. I didn't need to read it twice. It was my daughter. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. It felt as though every memory I'd ever shared with her was being replayed in my mind, searching for an answer I hadn't seen before. The jeweler gently broke the silence. "I never accused her of stealing it," he said. "I simply told her I couldn't buy it unless she could tell me why the inscription mattered." I looked up. "What did she say?" He sighed. "Nothing. She just stood there staring at the ring." Then her eyes filled with tears. "That wasn't the answer I expected," she finally whispered. He continued, "You don't understand. I don't have a choice." I felt my chest tighten. For the first time since the ring disappeared, I wasn't feeling angry. I was confused. The jeweler went on. "I asked if someone in her family was sick, or if she was in some kind of financial trouble. She wouldn't answer. She simply picked up the ring, thanked me for my time, and walked out." I immediately reached for my phone. This time, when I called, she answered almost instantly. "Dad." Her voice was trembling before I even said a word. "I know where you are." Those 7 words stopped me cold. "How?" I asked. "The jeweler called me after you walked in," she admitted quietly. "He said he thought I needed to come back and tell you the truth myself." Less than 20 minutes later, the bell above the shop door rang. She stepped inside. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen as if she hadn't slept all night. The confidence I'd heard in her voice just days earlier was completely gone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she slowly reached into her purse. She placed my wife's wedding ring on the glass counter. The room became silent. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at the ring, then back at my daughter. "If you needed money," I asked softly, "why didn't you just come to me?" The tears she'd been trying so hard to hold back finally began to fall. "Because," she said, struggling to get the words out, "I was ashamed." She told me that over the past year, her husband's business had failed. Bills had piled up faster than they could pay them. Credit cards were maxed out. Collection notices had started arriving almost every week. They'd borrowed from friends, emptied their savings, and even sold some of their own belongings. But it still wasn't enough. Then one afternoon, while helping clean my house, she'd seen me place the ring back inside the velvet box. That's when the thought entered her mind. She tried to fight it. For days, then weeks, until desperation became stronger than her judgment. She lowered her head and quietly said the words that broke my heart more than anything else. "I kept telling myself I'd sell it, pay the bills, and somehow buy it back before you ever noticed it was gone." She looked up at me through tears. "But I forgot something." I swallowed hard. "What was that?" She answered in barely more than a whisper. "You don't replace 48 years of love." And in that moment, I realized this story had never really been about a ring. It was about what desperation can make even good people believe they're capable of doing. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The ring rested between us on the glass counter, catching the afternoon light as though nothing had happened. It looked exactly the way it always had. Yet somehow, everything had changed. I reached out and gently picked it up. The familiar weight settled into my hand. For the first time in 2 days, I could finally breathe. Without saying a word, the jeweler quietly stepped away, giving us the privacy we both needed. My daughter stood motionless, her head lowered, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she whispered. "I don't even know if I deserve it." I looked down at the ring for a few seconds before carefully placing it back inside the little velvet box. Then I looked at her. "You know," I said quietly, "your mother used to tell me that raising a child wasn't about making sure they never made mistakes. It was about making sure they always knew where home was when they did." Slowly, she looked up. Her face was covered in tears. "I failed you, Dad." I gently shook my head. "No, you made a terrible decision. That isn't the same as being a terrible daughter." The moment those words left my mouth, she broke down. Not with loud sobs, just the kind of quiet crying that comes from carrying too much guilt for too long. For months, I'd convinced myself she'd stopped caring about the memories that meant everything to me. Standing there,
I finally understood the truth. She hadn't stopped loving her family. She'd simply allowed fear to speak louder than love, and fear has a way of making good people believe they're completely alone. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. For a while, neither of us spoke. She was mourning the choice she'd made. I was mourning every conversation we'd never had. If she'd only told me how desperate things had become, if I'd asked a few more questions, perhaps none of this would have happened. When we finally stepped apart, I smiled through the tears. Next time life becomes too heavy, I said, promise me you won't carry it alone. She nodded. I promise. Before we left, I turned toward the jeweler. I'll never be able to thank you enough, he smiled. I've been doing this job for over 40 years. I've held thousands of rings in my hands. Most were worth money. He glanced at the little velvet box. Yours was worth a lifetime. Those words stayed with me all the way home. That evening, I placed the ring back inside its little velvet box and returned it to the bookshelf, just like I'd done every Sunday for years. Only this time, I left the lid open for a little while. I sat beside it, thinking about everything that little ring had survived. 48 years of marriage, the loss of my wife, a moment of desperation, a family that had come dangerously close to falling apart, yet somehow, it had still found its way home. These days, my daughter comes over every Sunday morning. The first time she came back after everything happened, she quietly placed fresh flowers beside her mother's photograph before she said a single word. She didn't know I was watching. I never told her. We made breakfast together. We drank coffee. And for the first time in a very long while, the house didn't feel quite so quiet. Every Sunday, before we sit down together, I still open that little velvet box. Not because I'm afraid the ring will disappear again, but because every time I see it, I'm reminded that the strongest families aren't the ones who never break. They're the ones willing to find their way back to one another. If this story reminds you of someone you've been meaning to call, don't wait for fear, pride, or silence to steal one more day. Have the conversation while you still can. Because memories are precious, but the people we create them with are priceless.